The lantern swung wild in Kieran Nash's hand as he threw open the barn door, his heart hammering against his ribs, his hand already resting on the grip of his Colt revolver. Someone had tripped the wire he'd strung across the south gate. A simple trick, a tin can rattling against a fence post. And in a town like Caldwell Creek in the year 1882, a noise in the night could mean outlaws, cattle thieves, or worse. He'd seen 3 men shot dead in this very county over less than a stolen horse. He wasn't about to be the 4th. The lantern light swept across the hay-filled stalls, casting long orange fingers of shadow along the wooden beams, and Kieran raised it higher, his jaw set hard, his eyes scanning every corner. That was when he saw her. She was curled in the far stall, half buried beneath a pile of loose hay, her dark hair fanned out beneath her cheek, her dress so torn at the hem that the fabric barely reached her ankles. She was dead still, and for one gut-twisting second he thought she was dead entirely. His breath stopped. Then her chest rose, slow and shallow, and his whole body exhaled in a single shuddering wave. She was sleeping, just sleeping, but the bruise along her jaw, mottled purple and raw, was not the mark of someone who had simply wandered off the road. And the rope burn around her left wrist, still red and weeping at the edges, was not something a woman earned by accident. Kieran Nash stood there for a long moment, the lantern swaying, his jaw tight enough to ache. He was the sheriff of Caldwell Creek. He had a duty. He had a protocol. There were rules about vagrants, about unidentified women, about people who crept onto private property, which in this case was also his property, his barn, his land. The rules said he ought to wake her, question her, and if she had no lawful reason to be in his county, he had the authority to escort her straight to the county line. He knew what the rules said. He stood there for another long, silent minute, listening to her breathe. Then he set the lantern down on a hay bale so it cast its warmth over her without blinding her, shrugged off his canvas riding coat, and laid it over her as gently as he had ever done anything in his life. He told himself it was nothing, just the decent thing. He told himself that all the way back to the house. He was still telling himself that 3 days later, when everything between them had already become something else entirely, something that scared him far more than any outlaw's gun. 2 weeks before that October night, Kieran Nash had been sitting at his desk in the Caldwell Creek Sheriff's office, staring at a letter he'd read 11 times and still couldn't make himself answer. The letter was from the Territorial Marshal's office in Dodge City, and it contained a very polite, very formal suggestion that Sheriff Nash was getting too old at 32 for the job, and that perhaps a younger, more ambitious man might serve the town better. It had been signed by Marshal Dean Holt, who was 47, and who Kieran suspected had been bribed by 2 of Caldwell Creek's wealthiest landowners, Curtis Vane and his business partner Ellie Pruitt, who had been wanting a more cooperative lawman for the better part of 2 years. Kieran wasn't old, but he was tired. That much he couldn't argue. He'd taken the sheriff's badge 6 years ago, after his father passed and left him the farmstead on the east end of town. And after the previous sheriff, a decent man named Tom Garfield, had taken a bullet from a cattle thief named Ramos and died in the dust before the doctor could even be fetched. Kieran had been a deputy for 2 years by then. Nobody else had wanted the star, so he'd pinned it on and kept going. 6 years of keeping the peace between stubborn cattle ranchers and equally stubborn homesteaders. 6 years of dragging drunks out of saloons, mediating land disputes, tracking horse thieves, and once, memorably, talking down a man named Virgil Cork who had barricaded himself inside the grain mill for 4 days over a debt he couldn't pay. 6 years of being the person everyone came to when everything else had failed. He set the letter in the drawer and didn't think about it for the rest of the afternoon. He thought about it again at 3 in the morning, when the tin can rattled against the south gate fence post. Now it was morning, pale and cold, and Olivia Dawes was sitting at his kitchen table wrapped in his coat and holding a tin cup of coffee with both hands, as if she were afraid someone might take it from her. She hadn't told him her name yet. She hadn't told him anything yet. She'd woken to find him sitting in the wooden chair across the barn, reading by lantern light as she slept. And the first thing she'd done was scramble backward into the corner of the stall with a piece of broken fence rail in her hand. He'd set the book down very slowly. He'd held both hands out to the sides, open, empty. He'd said very quietly, "You're safe. I'm not going to hurt you." She'd held the fence rail for another full minute, her dark eyes not leaving his face, reading him the way someone reads a landscape for ambush points. Then, slowly, she'd lowered it. He'd brought her inside. He'd heated the coffee. He'd set bread and a piece of cold salt pork on the table and gone to stand by the window while she ate, giving her space, keeping himself where she could see him. Now she was looking at him with those same careful, measuring eyes, and Kieran Nash was very deliberately not looking back at her the way he wanted to, because she was beautiful. That was the simple, inconvenient truth of it. Even bruised, even exhausted, even with hay in her hair and fear still faint in the set of her mouth, she was remarkable, strong jaw, full lips, a complexion like warm-toned walnut wood, eyes so dark they were almost black and so alive with intelligence it was slightly unsettling. He looked out the window at his south pasture. "You don't have to tell me anything," he said. A silence. "You're the sheriff," she said. Her voice was low and a little rough, like she hadn't used it in days. "Is that badge real or for show?" He touched the star on his chest without thinking about it. "Real enough." "Then I probably ought to tell you who I am before you find out some other way." He turned from the window to look at her then, and she was looking straight at him, the coffee cup still held in both hands, her chin level, her expression composed in the careful way of someone who has practiced composing it. "My name is Olivia Dawes," she said, "and there are men looking for me. I don't know how far behind they are, but they won't stop. So if you're going to turn me away, I'd rather you did it now before I get attached to the coffee." Kieran looked at her for a long moment. "How many men?" he said. "3 that I know of, possibly 4. Curtis Vane hired them." The name hit him like a flat stone between the eyes. Curtis Vane. The wealthiest cattle rancher in Caldwell Creek County. The man who had very likely bribed Marshall Holt to have him removed. The man who owned half the water rights in the county and was quietly working on owning the other half. Kieran pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "Tell me everything," he said, "and then I'll decide what to do." Olivia Dawes was 26 years old. She had been born in St. Louis to a schoolteacher mother and a father who'd come west from Ohio with nothing but a surveyor's license and a belief that the land rewarded honest work. Her father, George Dawes, had spent 12 years surveying land in Kansas Territory and had eventually filed on a quarter section of prime grassland east of Caldwell Creek, land with a creek running through it, good soil, access to 2 trade routes, and had built a modest but solid homestead on it. George Dawes had died of a fever 3 years ago, leaving the land to Olivia, who was the only family he had left after her mother passed years earlier. Olivia had stayed. She'd hired a hand named Jacob Prout, kept the cattle small and manageable, sold cream and eggs to town, and done exactly what her father had taught her, worked honestly and trusted that the land would carry her. What she hadn't known was that her father's quarter section sat directly across the path of Curtis Vane's planned expansion. Vane wanted a cattle drive route between his two largest ranches, and the most direct and profitable path ran straight through the Dawes property. He'd offered to buy her out twice. She'd refused both times. The third time he hadn't sent an offer. He'd sent 3 men. They'd come at night 2 weeks ago. They'd taken her from her own bedroom, bound her hands, told her that she would sign the deed over, or she would disappear, and nobody would ask any uncomfortable questions. Her hand Jacob had tried to stop them, and they'd beaten him badly and left him in the yard. She'd been kept in a locked room in an outbuilding on the Vane ranch for 9 days. On the 10th day, a Mexican ranch hand named Lewis had left the lock undone. Deliberately, she thought, though he'd never say so outright, and she'd walked out in the night with nothing but what she wore and one piece of information she'd managed to steal. She'd found a letter. A letter between Vane and a man named Emmett Pruitt. Elie Pruitt's younger brother, that detailed not just the land grab but a far larger scheme involving falsified water rights documents and forged survey records that had been filed with the county land office. The letter named names, amounts, dates. It was damning. It was exactly the kind of evidence that could put Curtis Vane in a federal prison. She'd memorized every word of it. She hadn't taken the letter itself because she'd known they'd search her before she got 10 steps from the property. But she carried every line of it in her head, and she'd been moving east through the dark Kansas night for 4 days, sleeping in fields and creek beds, and now, apparently, a stranger's barn. When she finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a crow was calling from the cottonwood by the well. Kieran Nash sat very still for a very long time. "You're sure about the letter," he said. "You're sure about the names and the amounts?" "I read it 3 times, she said. "I have an excellent memory. My mother was a school teacher. She made sure of it." "The letter mentioned Elie Pruitt," he said carefully. "Elie Pruitt, the business partner, his brother Emmett. But yes, Elie's name was in it too, as the man who filed the forged documents with the land office." Kieran was quiet again. His hands, she noticed, were very still on the table. He had the kind of hands that had done hard physical work, broad across the palm, knuckles scarred, and the kind of self-containment that came from years of being the person in the room who couldn't afford to panic. "All right," he said at last. She looked at him. "All right what?" "All right, you stay," he said. "For now, until we figure out how to handle this." She studied him with those careful dark eyes. "You could be working for Vane." "I could be," he agreed calmly. "You'll have to decide whether you think I am." Another silence. The crow called again. "You read books in the barn rather than wake me up," she said. "A man working for Curtis Vane would have dragged me back before sunrise." He met her eyes then, and something between them settled, not into comfort exactly, but into a kind of mutual, careful acknowledgement. "I'm going to need you to stay inside," he said. "Keep away from the windows facing the road. Vane will have people in town who watch this place." "Why does Vane have people watching the sheriff's house?" "Because Vane has been trying to get rid of me for 2 years," he said. "And I've been letting him think he might succeed." She looked at him steadily. "That was a choice." "Everything's a choice," he said. "Some of them just look like circumstances." He got up and began clearing the breakfast things with a quiet efficiency that surprised her. And Olivia Dawes sat in the warmth of a stranger's kitchen and felt, for the first time in 4 days, like she might actually survive this. She was not naive enough to call that safety. But it was something. The days that followed were taut and careful, like living in the pause between a drawn breath and a spoken word. Kieran kept Olivia's presence a strict secret. He told his one deputy, a 22-year-old named Sam Tillies, who was earnest and honest and still a little young for the job, but getting better fast, only that he had a visiting cousin staying at the farmhouse. Sam accepted this with the cheerful incuriosity of youth and went about his duties in town without asking further questions. Olivia kept to the house during daylight, which she managed with a restless, coiled patience that told Kieran she was not by nature a person who stayed still well. He found her on the second morning reorganizing his kitchen stores in a way that actually made considerably more sense than his own system, and on the third morning mending a tear in his spare horse blanket with small, neat stitches that were better work than anything he could have done. "You don't have to do that," he said the first morning. "I can't sit here and breathe your air for free," she said, not looking up from the flour sacks. "You're not breathing it for free. You're going to help me put Curtis Vane in a federal prison." "That's later," she said. "This is now." He left her to it. On the fourth evening, he came home from a long day of deliberately ordinary sheriff's work. A fence dispute between two neighbors, a drunk who needed sleeping off in the jail cell, a report of a missing calf that turned out to have simply wandered into a neighboring pasture, and found Olivia standing at the stove making something that smelled so good it stopped him in the doorway. "Corn chowder," she said without turning around. "You had corn, you had salt pork, you had an onion, and you had a very sad-looking potato." He took off his hat and hung it on the hook by the door. "My cooking runs more toward things that don't require timing." "I can tell," she said. "I found hardtack in your bread box." "Hardtack, Kieran, on purpose." He almost smiled, almost. He sat down at the table and watched her move around his kitchen with the practiced confidence of a woman who had been feeding herself and working her own land for years, and something pulled tight and uncomfortable in his chest. He'd lived alone since he was 24. His father had been a solitary man and had raised a solitary son. Kieran had liked it, had told himself he liked it at any rate. The clean order of a space inhabited by one person. No negotiations, no compromises, no one to worry about. He was revising that opinion with some discomfort. They ate at the small kitchen table with the window showing the last copper light draining from the western sky, and somewhere between the chowder and the coffee she made afterward. Strong, properly made, the way he'd tried to make it himself and never quite achieved. They started talking. Not about Vane. Not about the letter or the land or the danger moving toward them like weather on a flat horizon. Just talking. About her father's surveys and the way he'd taught her to read a landscape by the shape of the grasses. About the school she'd attended in St. Louis and the Shakespeare her mother used to read aloud on Sunday evenings. About the particular quality of Kansas light in October, the way it turned everything amber and sharp-edged and a little melancholy. He told her things he hadn't told anyone in years. About being a deputy and watching Tom Garfield die in the dust, and picking up the badge before he'd had time to think about whether he wanted it. About the letter from Marshall Holt in the drawer, and the particular brand of exhaustion that came from 6 years of being everyone's last resort. "Do you want to stop?" she asked. "Being sheriff," he thought about it honestly, "I don't know how, it's the thing I do." "That's not the same as wanting it." "No," he agreed, "it isn't." She looked at him across the small table in the lamplight, and the shadows were kind and the corn chowder was warming them both from the inside. And Kieran Nash was suddenly very aware of being 32 years old and sitting in his own kitchen feeling something he hadn't felt in so long. He'd almost stopped believing he was capable of it. He stood up and carried his cup to the wash basin. "I'm going to go into town tomorrow and speak to a man named John Farley," he said, keeping his back to her. "He's a land surveyor, retired, honest, and he knew your father. If we can get him to corroborate the forged survey claim, along with your testimony about the letter, we have the bones of a federal case. I'll send a telegram to the federal land office in Topeka. And while you're doing that, you stay inside," he said. "Keep the rifle loaded." It's the Winchester on the rack by the back door. You know how to shoot. My father taught me with the same thoroughness he taught me everything else." "Good," he said. He turned back, and she was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between warmth and a wary sorrow, like someone standing at a window watching the weather come. "Thank you, Kieran," she said quietly, "for not turning me away." He looked at her. The lamplight was in her hair and her dark eyes were very steady and very honest, and he felt the full weight of what she was carrying. The fear, the displacement, the 4 days of running through the dark, the grim uncertainty of what was still ahead. And he wanted very much to close the distance between them and do something that would be profoundly unwise. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "We haven't finished this." He went to bed. He did not sleep for a long time. The trouble arrived faster than either of them had expected. On the 5th morning, Kieran came back from town with a newspaper folded tight in his hand, and a look on his face that Olivia read immediately as carefully controlled alarm. "Vane's put out a story," he said, spreading the newspaper on the table. "Says you burned down part of his outbuilding before you ran. Says you were an unstable tenant worker he'd taken in out of charity, and you repaid him with arson." Olivia looked at the paper. Her name was right there in black ink. There was a physical description. There was a $20 reward. "He moved faster than I thought," she said. "He's scared," Kieran said. "That letter. He knows you saw it. He's trying to establish you as a criminal before you can establish him as one." $20, she said, with a dry steadiness that made him look at her with something very close to admiration. "It's enough to make people talk," he said. "I need to get ahead of this. Farley is willing to meet tonight privately. I want to write down everything you told me about that letter, every name, every amount, every date in your own hand. Sworn statement," she nodded. "I'll write it now." He got her paper and a pen and an ink bottle, and she sat at the table and began to write in a clear, firm script that did not waver or hedge, setting down from memory every detail of the letter she'd read in Curtis Vane's locked-out building while 3 men stood between her and the door. Kieran read it over her shoulder as she wrote, and the depth and precision of her recall was genuinely remarkable. Names, dollar amounts, dates of filing, parcel numbers. The name of the land office clerk who had accepted the forged documents, a man named Rupert Ames, who Kieran had always found slightly too nervous for an honest man. "This is enough to open a federal investigation," Kieran said when she finished. "Will they believe me?" He hesitated, and she saw the hesitation. "They'll try to discredit you," he said honestly. "A woman on her own making accusations against one of the wealthiest men in the county. Vane will have lawyers and influence. The federal process is slow. But if Farley corroborates the survey fraud, then it shifts from your word against Vane's to documented fraud on file with the Federal Land Office, which is a federal crime regardless of how much money Vane has." He looked at her. "It won't be easy or fast, but it can be done." She folded her hands on the table. "Then we do it." That evening, John Farley came to the farmhouse by the back route, through the south pasture, at Kieran's direction. He was a small, precise man in his 60s with a white beard and quick, intelligent eyes, and when he saw Olivia he stopped short and then straightened up slowly. "George Dawes's daughter," he said. "Lord above, you look exactly like your mother." The surprise of it, the sudden, unexpected intimacy of someone who had known her parents, who looked at her and saw people she'd loved and lost, moved across Olivia's face too fast for her to fully contain it. "You knew my father well," she said. "Worked alongside him for 4 years in the early survey days," Farley said, sitting down. "He was the best surveyor I ever worked with, and an honest man in a time when honesty was a disadvantage." Now let me hear what you know about these forged documents, and let us see what we can do about it." They worked for 3 hours. Farley knew the county survey records down to individual parcel lines, and as Olivia recited the details from the letter, he cross-referenced them against a worn ledger he'd brought with him, and twice he stopped and said quietly, "There it is, right there. The numbers don't match the original survey by 40 feet on the east boundary. I always thought that parcel looked wrong." By the time they finished, Farley sat back in his chair with a look that was both grim and satisfied. "This is enough," he said. "Not for a local court. Vane owns too much of the local machinery, but for the federal land office. Yes, this is enough to trigger an investigation." "How long will it take?" Olivia asked. "A month, maybe 2, possibly longer. Federal wheels grind slow." He looked at her directly. "You're going to need to stay somewhere safe in the meantime." She looked at Kieran. Kieran looked back at her, and the question between them was quiet and enormous and had several layers that had nothing to do with federal investigations. "She stays here," he said. Farley glanced between them with the perceptive mildness of an old man who has seen a great deal of life. "Yes," he said simply. "I thought so." After Farley left, Olivia stood at the window looking out at the dark pasture, and Kieran stood near the table not looking at her, and the house felt very full of something that neither of them had said. "A month," she said. "Possibly 2, possibly longer." "That's a long time to impose on someone," she said. "You're not imposing," he said. She turned from the window. "You could lose your badge over this, if Vane gets to Marshal Holt before we get to the federal office." "Holt already wants my badge," he said. "If I lose it trying to do the right thing, that's a better reason to lose it than because Curtis Vane paid the right price." She looked at him steadily. There was something in her expression that was reaching toward him and holding itself back simultaneously, and he recognized it because he was experiencing exactly the same thing. "Why did you do it?" she said quietly. "The morning you found me. You could have woken me up and sent me back to the road. Why did you leave your coat over me and let me sleep?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwood with a sound like whispered water. "Because you had rope burns on your wrists," he said. "And because it was cold." She nodded slowly as if this answer confirmed something. "Kieran," she said. "Don't," he said, a beat. "Don't what?" she said very carefully. He looked at her finally all the way without the careful distance he'd been maintaining for 5 days. "Don't say whatever it is you're about to say until we're through this. Until you're safe and this is done. Because if you say it now," he stopped. "If I say it now," she pressed softly. "Then I'll have more to lose," he said. "And I can't afford to be scared of losing something while I'm trying to protect it." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "That's the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me." "Go to bed," he said, but not unkindly. She went. And he sat at the table for a long time with the lamp turned low, listening to the wind. The crisis came from a direction neither of them had fully anticipated. Kieran's deputy, Sam Tilley's, was entirely loyal and entirely unprepared for the speed and cunning of Curtis Vane's methods. On the 7th day, while Kieran was across town speaking with the telegraph operator about the most discreet way to send a document to Topeka, Sam was approached at the saloon by a man named Doak Pierce, one of Vane's hired men, though Sam didn't know that, who asked a few very casual, friendly questions about the sheriff's cousin, who was staying out at the Nash farmstead. Sam, who was 22 and had not yet learned that casual friendliness from a stranger always has a price, answered without thinking. Said she seemed real nice, quiet, dark hair, hadn't seen much of her himself. That was enough. An hour later, Kieran was walking back toward his office when he passed the hardware store and saw one of Vane's ranch hands standing outside it with a very studied nonchalance. Then he saw another one on the opposite side of the street, near the barber shop, and a third coming out of the dry goods store, all of them positioned to watch the road east out of town. He didn't change his pace. He didn't look at them directly. He walked into his office, closed the door, and stood for exactly 10 seconds thinking through the geometry of the problem. They knew she was here, or they strongly suspected it. They were watching the road to see if she'd bolt. That meant they didn't have enough certainty to move yet. If they'd been certain, they'd have already come to the farmhouse. They were waiting for her to confirm herself by running, which meant he couldn't let her run, and he couldn't let her stay still and wait for them to get more confirmation. He needed to change the situation faster than they could tighten their net. He found Sam in the back of the office, and he sat down with the young deputy and told him the truth, all of it, quickly, without embellishment. Sam went pale and then red and then very quietly furious at having been used. "I'm sorry, Sheriff," he said. "I didn't know. I didn't tell you." "That's on me," Kieran said. "Now listen. I need you to ride to the Farley place and tell John Farley that we need to move the timeline up. Tell him the documents need to go to Topeka by the fastest possible means. Can you do that tonight?" "Yes, sir." "Go out the back. Take the creek route south, not the main road." Sam nodded, already reaching for his hat. Kieran rode back to the farmhouse as evening was falling, fast but not so fast as to attract attention, and he found Olivia in the kitchen with the Winchester off the rack and already loaded. "Something changed," she said the moment she saw his face. "They know you're here," he said, "or close enough to it." She didn't panic. She set the rifle on the table with steady hands. "What do we do?" He sat down across from her. "I'm going to request a meeting with Curtis Vane." She stared at him. Hear me out," he said. "Vane is a calculating man. He doesn't move against me directly because he's still working through legal channels to have me removed, and he knows that anything overt would trigger federal attention he doesn't want. If I go to him openly as the sheriff, asking questions about the reward he's posted, that's legitimate business. That's my job. It also tells him I know something and that there are consequences to moving against me. And while you're doing that, you'll be moved," he said. "Not far. John Farley's wife's sister has a house on the north end of town, above the millinery shop. It's above suspicion. Nobody connects her to any of this. You'll stay there while Sam gets the documents to Topeka." She was looking at him with those dark, perceptive eyes. "And you'll be walking into Curtis Vane's house alone." "I've been dealing with Curtis Vane for 6 years," he said. "I know how he thinks. People who think they know how dangerous men think are often the ones who end up surprised," she said. There was a personal weight to that sentence that he didn't miss. "I'll be careful," he said. "That's not actually reassuring," she said with a sharpness that was covering something softer. He looked at her. Something in his chest contracted very precisely. "Olivia," he said. She looked at him. Her name in his mouth had a particular sound, careful and warm, the way you handle something valuable. "I'm not reckless," he said. "I am going to be very deliberate about this. And then it's going to be over, and you are going to have your land back and a federal court case against the man who took you from your home, and we are going to be standing somewhere that isn't the inside of an emergency." She held his gaze for a long, long moment. "And then," she said. "And then," he said, "you can say whatever you were going to say the other night." Something moved across her face, something warm and real and frightened and determined all at once. "I'm going to hold you to that," she said. "I know," he said. They moved her that night. Kieran drove the wagon the back way with Olivia inside beneath a canvas cover, a precaution, not a permanent hiding place, and delivered her to the home of a woman named Clara Holt, who was Farley's wife's sister and who was 60 years old, sharp as a tack, deeply unimpressed by Curtis Vane's money, and entirely willing to house a young woman in need. "I heard about George Dawes's daughter," Clara said, looking Olivia over with frankly appraising eyes. "Your father was a good man. The decent ones always go too soon. Come in, child. I have a room with a lock on the door and I sleep light and I still own a very persuasive shotgun." Olivia looked back at Kieran from the doorway. He touched the brim of his hat. "2 days," he said. "Maybe 3. "Be careful," she said, and the plainness of it, no flourish, no theater, just the 2 words and everything they meant stayed with him all the way back to the farmhouse. The meeting with Curtis Vane took place the following afternoon. Vane's ranch was the largest and best appointed in the county, a sprawling property with a proper 2-story house and corrals big enough to hold 300 head of cattle. Vane himself was 54, heavyset and smooth-faced, with the kind of easy, practiced charm that sat over something harder the way a good suit covers muscle. He received Kieran in his front room, standing, which was deliberate, not offering a seat, keeping the interaction on his terms, suggesting it would be brief. "Sheriff Nash," he said warmly. "What can I do for you?" "The reward notice," Kieran said. "The woman named Olivia Dawes. $20 for information." "Yes," Vane said easily. "She was a disturbed young woman who worked on my property and who, I'm sorry to say, burned one of my outbuildings and disappeared before I could find out what had gotten into her." "She burned the building," Kieran said in a tone that was perfectly neutral. "I'm afraid so," Vane said with a sorrow that was entirely manufactured. "That's a serious charge. Arson. Were you planning to file a formal complaint with my office?" A flicker behind Vane's smooth eyes. "I was handling it privately." "Privately," Kieran said. "So you posted a reward for a woman you wanted to handle privately, without a formal complaint, without a sheriff's report, without any of the legal processes that exist precisely for this situation." "I appreciate your thoroughness, Nash," Vane said, and the warmth had cooled just perceptibly. "But this is a matter between myself and a former employee." "Then I'd suggest you file the formal complaint or rescind the reward notice," Kieran said pleasantly. "An unofficial reward in my jurisdiction creates complications. You understand?" Vane looked at him for a measured moment. "I'll have my attorney look into the proper filing," he said. "That'd be just right," Kieran said. He held Vane's gaze for exactly 2 seconds longer than necessary. Then he put his hat back on and left. It was a small move, but it was a message. "I know what you're doing, and I'm watching." Vane would receive it. Whether it would slow him or accelerate him was the question. Kieran rode back into town and stopped at the telegraph office. The reply from Topeka arrived faster than he'd hoped. The Federal Land Office acknowledged receipt of the preliminary documentation Sam had delivered through Farley, and confirmed that an investigative agent would be dispatched to Caldwell Creek within 10 days to take sworn statements and review the original survey records. 10 days. Kieran held the telegram for a moment, then folded it into his shirt pocket. 10 days was a long time in a situation with moving pieces. He went to Clara Holt's millinery shop. Olivia was in the upstairs room, sitting at a small desk near the window, close enough to the window to let in light, angled so she couldn't be seen from the street. She had clearly been reading. There were 2 books from Clara's shelf open in front of her. She looked up the moment he opened the door, and the relief that crossed her face was unmistakable. 10 days, he said. She exhaled slowly. 10 days. He pulled a chair up and sat near the wall. The meeting with Vane went as expected. He's cautious. He's going to try to move through legal channels, his attorney, the formal complaint, to create a record that discredits you before the federal agent arrives. So we need to make sure the federal agent hears from someone more credible than just me, she said. Farley will testify. I'll testify. Clara has already offered to make a statement confirming you arrived in her home in an injured condition consistent with captivity. He paused. There's also the matter of Jacob Prout. My hand, she said immediately. The man they beat, is he all right? He's alive. He's at the Grover homestead 2 miles north of your property. A neighbor took him in. Sam checked on him today. He's recovered enough to talk, and he wants to talk. Kieran watched her absorb this. He saw everything, Olivia. He can testify to the men who came, what they said, what they did. The tension around her eyes softened with something that was partly relief and partly grief. He tried to stop them, she said quietly. He got beaten half to death for it. He was just a good, honest man trying to do right by the person who employed him. He'll have his say, Kieran said. That's what this is for. She looked down at the desk for a moment, then she looked back at him. You've been running all of this. The telegrams, the witnesses, the Farley documentation. This is far outside what you're required to do as sheriff. You're a resident of my county, he said. You've been abducted, held, threatened, and driven from your own land. That's well within what I'm required to do. That's the duty of it, she said. I'm asking about the rest. He met her eyes. In the pale light coming through the gauze curtain, she was very still and very direct, and he had run out of things to hide behind. I told you, he said quietly. We're not through this yet. We're close enough, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The room was very small and very quiet, and Clara's old clock ticked steadily from the shelf, and the distance between them was about 4 feet of bare floorboard. Olivia, he said. Kieran, she said, with a faint, deliberate echo that wasn't mocking. It was something else, something warmer. When this is done, he said slowly, when it's resolved, I'd like to call on you properly. She was quiet for a moment. Then, you mean come to the door with your hat in your hand and make polite conversation with Clara Holt as a chaperone? Something like that, he said, with the careful patience of a man navigating unfamiliar and slightly terrifying territory, her mouth curved, not a small, controlled smile but a real one, full and warm, and it hit him somewhere considerably below his ribs. I would like that, she said. Very much. He stood up. He picked up his hat. He went to the door. Kieran, she said. He turned. Don't let it take too long, she said. He left before he did something impractical. The 9 days before the federal agent arrived were not quiet. On the 3rd day, Curtis Vane filed the formal arson complaint, as Kieran had expected. Kieran accepted it at his office, noted it with perfect procedural correctness, and sent a duplicate copy by mail to the federal land office in Topeka, with a cover letter detailing the timeline of Olivia's captivity and the injuries she'd sustained. On the 5th day, 2 of Vane's men rode past the farmhouse 3 times in one afternoon, making no attempt to be subtle about it. Kieran was there the 2nd and 3rd times they passed, sitting in plain sight on the porch with a rifle across his knees and a book in his lap, and they didn't stop. On the 6th day, Sam came to Kieran with a tight, worried face and a piece of information he'd picked up at the saloon. Doak Pierce, Vane's man, had been asking questions about Olivia's land deed. Specifically, whether it was still in her name and whether there was any legal mechanism by which an absent landowner could be declared to have abandoned their claim. He's trying to find a legal angle, Kieran told Olivia that evening. He'd been visiting her at Clara's each day under the pretext of official check-ins, which Clara participated in with serene and transparent acceptance. If he can establish you've abandoned the claim, he might be able to file on the land before the federal case moves fast enough to stop him. "He can't do that legally," she said. "I haven't been absent long enough and the circumstances." "He doesn't need to do it legally," Kieran said. "He needs to do it fast enough that the claim is filed before the investigator reviews it. Creating a contested title is almost as good as owning it. It ties up the land in court proceedings for years, and he has better lawyers and more money and more time." Olivia stood very still for a moment. Then she said, "I need to go to the land office." "That's not safe." "I need to go to the land office and file a formal declaration of intent to return to and maintain possession of my land, with the date and the circumstances of why I've been absent, countersigned by the sheriff of the county." She looked at him. "That countersignature would be you." He thought about it. "That's legally sound," he said slowly. "It doesn't just need to be legally sound," she said. "It needs to be done tomorrow before Vane moves." He looked at her. She was standing with that particular quality of composed determination he'd come to recognize. Not bravado, not recklessness, but a clear-eyed willingness to walk into hard places when it was necessary. "In and out," he said. "Early morning, before Vane's people are watching the office." "In and out," she agreed. Clara produced a clean dress and a bonnet the next morning, and Kieran walked beside Olivia through the early, cool main street of Caldwell Creek, while the town was still more asleep than awake. He walked at her right shoulder, close enough to be unmistakably present, a clear statement of his standing in relation to her circumstances. The land office clerk was a young man named Harvey, who was not Rupert Ames. Rupert Ames, it had recently emerged, had taken a sudden and convenient leave of absence from his position, which Farley had noted was very interesting timing indeed. Harvey was efficient and a little nervous, and stamped the declaration with the county seal without asking any questions that weren't directly procedural. They were back outside in less than 20 minutes. Olivia let out a long breath as they turned down the side street away from the main thoroughfare. "That's done," she said. "That's done," he confirmed. She looked sideways at him. They were walking close together in the narrow street, and the morning light was very clean and pale, and somewhere a rooster was completing its announcement to the neighborhood. "I've been thinking," she said, about the farm, when this is over. I've been running through what needs doing. The roof on the north side of the barn needs work before winter, and the south pasture fence has a section that Jacob mentioned before everything happened." She paused. "It's strange, thinking about practical things. It makes it feel real. Like it might actually happen." He glanced at her. "It will happen. You sound very certain." "I am certain," he said quietly. She looked at him for a moment, and the morning was still around them, and she said, "I think you might be the most certain person I've ever met. About things that most people are uncertain about." "I've had a lot of practice deciding what I believe," he said. "What do you believe about this?" He stopped walking. She stopped too, turning to face him in the side street with the pale October light falling on her, and he was struck all over again by the particular kind of beauty she had, not decorative beauty, not beauty that existed to be looked at, but the beauty of someone fully alive and fully present, meeting the world straight on. "I believe," he said carefully, "that you are one of the strongest and most capable people I have ever encountered. I believe the people who tried to take your land chose the wrong woman to threaten. I believe the federal investigator is going to arrive in 4 days, and that we are going to win this case." He paused. "And I believe that when it's over, if you'll allow it, I am going to do my level best to give you every reason to stay in Caldwell Creek." She was very still. "That's a lot of believing," she said. "Yes," he agreed. She looked at him for another long, significant moment. Then she reached out and very briefly, very precisely, put her hand against the front of his coat, just resting it there, over the badge, feeling the warmth through the canvas. Then she dropped it, and they walked back to Clara's. He thought about the warmth of her hand through the rest of the day with unreasonable frequency. The federal investigator arrived on a Thursday, 4 days after the declaration filing, riding in on the afternoon stage with a leather satchel and a serious face, and the quiet, methodical manner of a man who had spent a career separating truth from interest. His name was Agent Theodore Marsh, and he was with the General Land Office out of Topeka, and he had apparently read every document Kieran and Farley had sent him with considerable attention. He spent the first afternoon reviewing the county survey records with Farley and then the original Land Office filings with what remained of the county's honestly filed records. He spent the following morning taking a formal sworn statement from Jacob Prout, who had been brought carefully into town and who gave his testimony with quiet, painful precision. The men who had come, their names, their words, the way they had bound Olivia Dawes and taken her away in the dark. He spent that afternoon with Olivia. Kieran sat in the corner of Clara's upstairs room, present as a material witness and as the county sheriff, while Olivia gave her statement to Agent Marsh with the same extraordinary clarity and precision she had shown from the beginning. She recited the contents of the letter, every name, every figure, every date, and Marsh wrote it all down and asked careful follow-up questions, and at no point expressed doubt or skepticism, which Kieran had quietly been afraid of. When it was over, Marsh closed his notebook and said, "Miss Dawes, I want you to understand that the process from here will take some time. However, I can tell you that the preliminary evidence is significant. Forged federal survey documents are a federal crime, and the conspiracy you've described implicates several individuals beyond Mr. Vane. I expect this will be a substantial case." Olivia nodded. Her hands were folded in her lap and her back was straight, and she had not broken once through the entire 3 hours of testimony. "What happens to my land in the meantime?" she asked. "Your declaration of intent has been filed and flagged in the federal record," Marsh said. "Any attempt to file a competing claim will be visible and contestable. Mr. Vane's attorneys will know that. What about the arson charge? I'll be speaking with your county court about that," Marsh said with a slight, deliberate dryness. "Given the circumstances you've described, I suspect it will not survive scrutiny." After Marsh left, Olivia sat very quietly for a moment in the small upstairs room. Clara had gone downstairs with characteristic tact. It was just the two of them. Kieran sat across from her, watching her face. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said. Then she paused. "That's not entirely true. I'm relieved. And I'm tired in a way I haven't let myself be because I couldn't afford to be." She looked at him. "And I'm grateful. More than I know how to say." "You did the hard part," he said. "You carried that letter in your head for 4 days across the dark Kansas plain. That's not something I did." "You gave me somewhere to land," she said simply. He looked at her, really looked at her, and something in him let go of the careful, maintained distance he'd been keeping, not with a dramatic gesture but with a kind of quiet, interior surrender. "Olivia," he said. "Yes," she said, before he'd finished the thought, which made him pause. "Yes to what?" "Yes to whatever you were about to say," she said. "I've been saying yes to it for about 8 days now. I was just waiting for you to catch up." He laughed, an actual, genuine laugh that surprised them both, short and warm, unfurling something in his chest that had been compressed for a very long time. "I want to call on you properly," he said. "After this is resolved, I want to take you to dinner. I want to talk to you in a place that isn't a crisis. I want to know what you're like when nothing is chasing you." "I think you already know," she said softly. "You've been finding out for 9 days." "I want more than 9 days," he said. She looked at him with dark, steady eyes, and the afternoon light came through the curtain in bars of gold, and she said, "Then you'll have them." The resolution came in stages over the following weeks, as resolutions to large and complicated injustices tend to do. Rupert Ames, the land office clerk, was located in Wichita and arrested on federal charges related to the fraudulent filings. He cooperated with the federal investigation in exchange for a reduced sentence and provided written confirmation of the document forgeries and the individuals who had directed them. Illy Pruitt, faced with the cooperation of Ames and the documented evidence of his brother Emmett's involvement, quietly left Caldwell Creek one November morning without a word to anyone, and was later found to have relocated to Colorado, where he apparently spent several anxious months waiting for the legal net to close. It closed the following spring. Curtis Vane fought. He had lawyers and he had money and he had considerable local influence, and the fight took longer than Kieran had hoped and shorter than Kieran had feared. The federal case against him was anchored by the forged survey documents, corroborated by Farley's expert testimony, substantiated by Ames's confession, and made inarguable by Jacob Pruitt's eyewitness account of the abduction, which left no legal avenue for Vane to escape the most serious charges. Vane was indicted by a federal grand jury in January of 1883. The arson charge against Olivia Dawes was formally dismissed in November, 3 weeks after Marsh's visit. Olivia's land was secured and untouchable from the moment the federal flag went up on the record. In the meantime, Kieran Nash called on Olivia Dawes properly. He came to Clara's door on an October evening 9 days after Marsh's visit, hat in hand, in a clean shirt with his good coat and his hair combed, and Clara let him in with magnificent composure and sat in her parlor for exactly 20 minutes of entirely genuine conversation before declaring she was tired and going to bed, leaving them in the parlor with a lit lamp and a plate of Clara's excellent ginger biscuits. Olivia was wearing a dark blue dress Clara had helped her acquire. Her own clothing was still at the farm, which would be accessible again soon but wasn't yet, and her hair was pinned up, and she looked at him with those dark, alert eyes and said, "This is the calling properly then." "Yes," he said. "How does it feel?" "Terrifying," he said honestly, which made her laugh, and he decided immediately that her laugh was one of the finest things he'd encountered. They talked for 3 hours, not about land or lawyers or federal cases, about books, about her plans for the spring planting, about his father, who had been a difficult man to love but had loved his land with a wholeness that Kieran respected, about her mother's Shakespeare and whether Hamlet was sympathetic or infuriating, about what Kansas looked like in February when the snow came, and whether that was its most beautiful or most terrible season. When he left that night, he paused at the door. "Same time next week," he said. She was smiling. It was the full, warm smile that had hit him below the ribs before, and was now doing the same thing with additional force. "Same time next week," she said. He walked back to the farmhouse through the cool October night feeling something he didn't immediately have a word for, and then did. Happy. He was happy. It was a somewhat alarming discovery, and he sat with it thoughtfully as he walked. The formal dismissal of the arson charge came through on a Tuesday morning, and Kieran rode out to Clara's to deliver the news in person, and then drove Olivia out to the farm for the first time since she'd fled it. The farm was intact. Vane's men hadn't damaged it beyond what had happened the night of the abduction. She'd half expected to find it burned or ransacked, but it was simply quiet and still, and a little overgrown in the kitchen garden, a layer of dust on the inside from the weeks of no one living there. She stood in the door of her father's house for a moment, and Kieran stood back by the wagon and gave her the space to do it. She walked through every room slowly. She touched the kitchen table, the windowsill, the frame of the bedroom door. She stood in her father's study where his survey map still hung on the wall, slightly yellowed at the corners, and put her hand flat on the desk. When she came back out, her eyes were bright, but she was composed, and she said, "I need to get the stove lit and the kitchen aired out." "I'll check the roof on the north side of the barn," he said. They worked side by side through the afternoon, she clearing and airing the house, he patching the barn roof and checking the fence line and drawing water from the well. And at dusk, they sat on the porch steps with coffee and the last of the light, and it felt like something utterly ordinary and utterly extraordinary at the same time. "You don't have to fix the fence," she said. "The fence needed fixing," he said. "Jacob will be back in 2 weeks," she said. "He's recovered. He'll want his job back." "Good," Kieran said. "He's a good man." She looked at him in the fading light. "You're here every moment you're not working." "Yes," he said. "Kieran," she said. He looked at her. She was sitting one step below him, turned slightly toward him, and the evening was soft and cold and smelled of dry grass and the first hint of coming winter. "I love you," she said. Simply, directly, with no hedging or theater. The words hit him clean and clear like fresh water, and he felt them all the way through. "I know," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "I've been knowing for a while," he said. "Since the corn chowder, I think," she laughed. "The corn chowder. The way you moved around that kitchen like you'd been there 100 years, he said. "Like you just fit. And I realized it wasn't the kitchen you fit in." He paused. "It was the life." Her expression was very soft and very open, the careful, composed mask entirely gone, and she was just herself, remarkable, warm, real. "Say it back," she said. "I love you," he said, and the words came without effort, without the fear he'd expected, without anything except a certainty so complete it felt like recognizing something he'd always known. "I have loved you since I put my coat over a stranger sleeping in my barn." Possibly since before that, if we're being truthful about how time works. She reached out and took his hand. They sat on the porch steps as the stars came out, one by one, over the dark Kansas plain, and held on. The months that followed were the ordinary kind of extraordinary, the slow accumulation of days that build a life. In November, Kieran repaired the north barn roof properly, with Jacob Pruitt's help, the three of them working through 2 cold days with hammers and fresh timber, and enough coffee to warm a small army. Jacob, who was a quiet and decent man in his mid-30s, took Kieran's presence on the Dawes property with the composed approbation of someone who was simply glad to see his employer safe and cared for. In December, Marshal Dean Holt came back through with another formal suggestion about retirement, and Kieran sat in his office and looked at the man with perfectly calm eyes and said, "My jurisdiction has successfully initiated a federal prosecution against the largest case of land fraud in this county's history. I expect my position is considerably more secure than it appeared in September, but I appreciate your concern." Holt left without pressing the matter further. The letter of commendation from the General Land Office in Topeka arrived in January, and Kieran put it in the drawer without much ceremony and went back to work. He proposed to Olivia in February. He didn't make a production of it. He came to the farm on a Sunday afternoon, and they'd been walking the south pasture together, checking the fence line that had been repaired in the fall. And the snow was thin and crisp underfoot, and the sky was an enormous pale blue, and she was telling him something about her father's surveying methods when he stopped walking. She stopped too and looked at him. "Marry me," he said. "Not as a question, I mean it is a question, but I mean it as something I've decided." She looked at him for a moment in the winter light. "That's a terrible proposal," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "I know. I had a better one prepared, and then I saw you and the snow and that particular sky, and I forgot all of it." She studied his face with those dark, steady eyes. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes. Since the barn, Kieran. Since you put your coat over me and let me sleep." He pulled her in and kissed her for the first time, standing in the thin snow of the south pasture of her father's farm with the pale February sky enormous above them, and the world very still and very cold and very beautiful. They married in April. The ceremony was at the small white church on Caldwell Creek's Main Street, performed by the town's reverend on a warm spring morning with the cottonwoods just beginning to bud, and the first meadowlarks calling from the fence posts along the road. The church was full. The town had watched this particular situation unfold for 7 months and had considerable investment in its outcome. Clara Holt sat in the front pew with a handkerchief she insisted she didn't need. John Farley and his wife sat beside her. Jacob Prout sat in the third row with his hat on his knee, back entirely straight, with an expression of profound satisfaction. Sam Tilley sat near the back with the wide, uncomplicated grin of a young man who was wholeheartedly glad about something. Olivia wore a cream cotton dress with small blue flowers embroidered at the collar and cuffs. She'd sewn it herself over the winter evenings, in the farmhouse by lamplight, which Kieran thought was characteristic, and which he found almost unbearably dear. She walked to the front of the church alone, which was her choice, which Kieran had thought was entirely right. When the Reverend spoke his words and Kieran spoke his voice was steady and low and meant every syllable, and when he put the ring on her hand, the simple band of silver, made by the town's craftsman, modest and clean and exactly what she'd said she wanted, he held her hand a moment before letting it go. "I do," she said, and looked at him with dark eyes absolutely clear of everything except certainty, and he thought he would carry the memory of her face in that moment for the rest of his life. They had a wedding supper at Clara's, long tables set in the side yard under a sky going pink and gold in the evening, with good food and strong coffee, and several bottles of cider, and a great deal of conversation. And at some point during the evening, John Farley stood and gave a quiet, dignified toast about George Dawes and what a man he had been and how he would have been proud. And there was a silence after that was full and warm rather than sad. They went home to the farmhouse that night, the Dawes farmhouse, which was becoming something else, a shared thing, a beginning, and that is their private business, except that the windows were lit and the lantern hung on the porch hook, and the night was soft and mild and the meadowlarks were silent and the stars were out. The Curtis Vane trial concluded in June of 1883. The federal case had proceeded exactly as Agent Marsh had indicated, methodically, thoroughly, with the weight of documented evidence behind it. Vane's attorneys had been resourceful, but the evidence had been decisive. Elie Pruitt had been apprehended in Colorado in March and had, facing the full weight of the federal charges, cooperated extensively. Emmett Pruitt had done the same. Curtis Vane was convicted on 6 counts of federal land fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction, and was sentenced to 7 years in a federal penitentiary. Several members of his network, including Rupert Ames, received lesser sentences for their cooperation. Olivia read the report from the territorial newspaper one evening on the farmhouse porch, and then set the paper on her knee and looked out at the south pasture, where the summer grass was long and gold in the evening light. "Done," she said. Kieran sat beside her in his own chair, 2 cups of coffee between them on the small table he'd made over the winter. "Done," he agreed. She was quiet for a moment. "Do you know what I thought the first night? In the barn before you came in with the lantern. I'd been lying there for about an hour listening to the horses, wondering if I should keep moving, wondering if there was any point. He looked at her. I thought just one night, she said. Just let me have one night where I'm not running. I don't care what comes after. Just this one night in the warm with something breathing nearby that isn't hostile. She picked up her coffee cup. And then you came in and you were so very still and so very careful and you put your coat over me and I thought, oh, it might be all right. He looked at her profile in the evening light, the strong, clean line of her jaw, the steadiness in her. It is all right, he said. She turned to look at him, and the warmth in her face was entire and unguarded. Yes, she said, it is. By August, she was carrying their first child, which she told him on a Tuesday morning over breakfast with a directness that was pure Olivia. Simply looked up from her coffee and said, I think there's going to be another person in this house in the spring. He set down his cup. He looked at her for a moment. Then he stood up and walked around the table and put his hands on her face and kissed her with a thoroughness that knocked the breath out of both of them. Spring, he managed afterward. March, I think, she said, slightly flushed, entirely pleased. He sat back down. He picked up his coffee. He was smiling in a way that he could feel throughout his body and that showed no sign of abating. Boy or girl, he said. I have no way of knowing that, she said. What do you think? She considered it. Boy, she said. Though I have absolutely no basis for that impression. It was a boy. He arrived on a wild, windy March night in 1884 with a full set of lungs he used immediately and without reserve. And Kieran Nash, who had faced down armed outlaws and cattle thieves and a federal corruption case without once losing his composure, held his son for the first time and was completely undone. Olivia, who had just done something extraordinarily hard and was accordingly tired in ways that ran very deep, watched her husband's face with an expression of profound love and slight amusement. Hello, Kieran said to the baby, in a voice that was very quiet and not entirely steady. The baby considered him with dark, unfocused eyes that were, in that first hour, already changing toward the darkness they would hold all his life. He has your eyes, Kieran said. He has your nose, she said. Poor thing. He looked at her with wet eyes, and she looked back at him with her hair loose, and her smile exhausted and warm and real. And outside the wind moved through the cottonwood with a sound like whispered water. And inside the farmhouse was lit and full and alive. They named him George for her father. The years that followed braided themselves together the way good years do, made of ordinary things that are not ordinary at all when you look at them directly. Sam Tillies became, by degrees, an excellent deputy, and by the time Kieran stepped down from the sheriff's office 5 years later, Sam was the natural successor, pinning on the badge with the solemnity of someone who understood the weight of it. Kieran had a farm to run and a family to feed and had, over time, recognized that he'd given his best years to the county and could now give his remaining years to himself. He did not miss it as much as he'd expected. The farm grew. Olivia expanded the dairy operation in the second year, trading in cream and butter and eventually cheese, which Clara Holt declared the finest in the county, and sold from her shop window with considerable commercial enthusiasm. Jacob Prout stayed on, quiet and capable, and eventually married the schoolteacher's daughter from the neighboring homestead and built a small house on the north end of the property. George grew into a serious, energetic boy with his mother's dark eyes and his father's stillness. And by the age of 4, he had opinions about horses that were already better informed than many adults. He followed his father around the pastures with devoted attention and followed his mother to the bookshelf with equal devotion, and both of his parents thought this was exactly right. In In the spring of 1887, Olivia told Kieran over breakfast, again on a Tuesday, which he later noted seemed to be her preferred day for significant announcements, that George was going to have company. This time it was a girl who arrived in October on a cool autumn morning, quieter than her brother had been, looking around the room from the very first moment with the alert, measuring gaze that Olivia recognized immediately. They named her Margaret, for Olivia's mother. George was fascinated by her, and somewhat bossy about her for approximately 6 weeks, after which she made her own views known with sufficient clarity that he revised his approach, and they became instead the kind of siblings who are entirely different and entirely devoted. There was an evening, one particular evening in the summer of 1888, the children both asleep. The long Kansas day finally darkened to a velvet indigo sky prickling with stars. When Kieran and Olivia sat on the porch in the warm night air with 2 cups of coffee, and the comfortable silence of people who have said everything important many times over and can rest in each other's company without words. "Do you remember," she said after a while. "Most things," he said. "Which thing?" "What you said. The night you told me not to say what I was about to say until it was done." She looked at the stars. "You said if I said it, then you'd have more to lose and you couldn't afford to be scared of losing something while you were trying to protect it." "I remember," he said. "I've been thinking about it." She turned to look at him. "You were wrong about one part." "Which part?" "You had it already," she said. "Before I said anything. The moment you put your coat over me in the barn and went to sit in that chair with your book, you'd already chosen it. The rest was just catching up." He looked at her for a long moment in the summer dark. This woman who had walked 4 days across the dark Kansas plain, with a letter full of secrets in her memory and her father's land in her heart, and every reason to be finished with trusting anyone, and who had looked at him across a kitchen table and made a careful, clear-eyed, courageous choice. "Yes," he said, "I had it already." She reached across the small space between their chairs and took his hand, and they sat in the warm night with the stars overhead and the children sleeping inside and the land spreading out in every direction around them, the south pasture fence long mended, the north barn roof tight against the weather, the kitchen garden overgrown no more. And the cottonwood by the well moved in the night air with a sound like whispered water, the same sound it had made on every significant night of their particular life. The night he'd walked back from the barn telling himself it was nothing. The night she'd said yes to obviously yes. The night George had arrived with his lungs and his opinions. The night Margaret had looked around the room with her mother's eyes. All of it accumulated and unbroken, leading from a lantern swung in a barn door to this porch, and this night and this hand in his hand. Kieran Nash, who had been a reluctant man in many ways, reluctant to take the badge, reluctant to want things, reluctant to be afraid of losing something he hadn't admitted he'd already claimed, looked out at the dark south pasture and felt the full, quiet weight of his own happiness, and was no longer reluctant about any of it. The land held them. The night held them. They held each other.